Good morning, everyone in this part of the world, and good afternoon in Europe. It is my pleasure to moderate this panel today. We have Rainer Matos from Mexico, currently based in Russia, for presenting this panel. I will tell you a bit about his background in order for you to know who we have here today for telling us more about this current phenomenon that is changing a lot of things, not only in Europe, but also around the world. So Rainer holds a bachelor's degree in international relations in El Colegio de Mexico. This institution is one of the most important in Latin America for social sciences. He also studied a master's degree in Russia and Eurasian studies in the European University of St. Petersburg. And he also holds a master's in applied and interdisciplinary history and the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg. He's currently finishing his PhD in Russian history under the joint program Global History Empires, together with the University of Turin. He has written several opinion articles on Russia and Ukrainian affairs for Mexican journals and newspapers, as well as articles published in both Mexican and international peer-reviewed journals, such as Ab Imperio, where he published his latest article on national classification of the School of the Communist International in December 2021. He has published 2 books and several publications about the topic. And now we have the pleasure to have him here for telling us more about this, current situation in Ukraine and Russia. And now I will just give you the word, Rainer. Go ahead, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Carla. No, the pleasure is all mine, really, to be with you and connected with people from all over the world, with students especially. I love to speak with students. It's the most refreshing part of all this situation that we have here in Russia, and for me personally, sometimes the press, the Mexican press especially, wants to speak to me. I already can't do that. I say no, but I always say yes to students, because I think it's very important for the young to understand, or to try to understand, what is going on in this region, in this part of the world, beyond, whatever CNN can tell us. I mean, right before I start, I would just like to make a short announcement, warning, I don't know how to call it. Nothing that I am going to tell you means to justify absolutely anything of what is going on right now. I know that it may sound at some point like that, because we have a very imposing narrative nowadays of what is going on, but actually I don't mean to justify absolutely anything. I mean to talk from an academic perspective, which is what I do. And I think we should not fall in the mistake of looking at everything that has happened earlier, before February 24th, 2022, based on what is going on right now. That would be a great mistake. As a historian, I think it should be the other way around. I think we should look at what is going on now by looking at the past, especially at the recent past. And that's what I want to do today, and to talk to you about Ukraine specifically. I'm going to touch upon the current conflict at the end, but and I know it will come out in the questions anyway, for sure. But I'm going to touch upon Ukraine because it's also in these narratives that we have nowadays. We don't really talk about Ukraine. We talk about Putin. We talk about the Ukrainian people in very abstract terms. We talk about Europe and European values in NATO, and we don't really talk about Ukraine's agency, which is the country in conflict. So that's what I want to do, and to give you this brief lesson of this last 30 years of Ukraine and the great debates inside Ukraine, its own actors, etc. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Sorry. Here. Nope, those are some old Russian documents. Sorry for that. Here we are. Can you see the maps? Yes. No?
No, we are seeing some words.
Okay, wait. Sorry about that. I may look young, but when it comes to technology, I'm bad. Now you see the maps.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I wanted to make this also a bit informal in the way of people who are not knowledgeable of the region, who don't really know about Ukraine, who do very different stuff, which is, I think, the case for many of you here. So I combined sort of informal maps, which you find on the internet, which are very interesting and very revealing of what whoever the author is wants to tell us. But there's also, I mean, I mean to provide a more academic content to whatever we're looking at here. So this is a very famous map. If you look up on the internet, Ukraine's construction, territorial construction, political construction, you find this one. It's not exactly accurate at all, but at least it gives you some hints, and it helps in some way to understand, even in this very informal way, how Ukraine, as any other country, we could say at many points in history, has been a construction, right? A political construction in many ways. So you have, of course, here in orange, what used to be the Ukrainian territory in 1654, which actually is quite of an anachronism, because it wasn't really called like that. It was the hetmanate back in the mid 17th century, which seceded from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, looking to make an alliance with the princes of Muscovy, the already Tsars of Muscovy, the proto-Russian state, what later would be the Russian state, but by that time it was the Tsardom of Muscovy, in order to balance against Polish domination, Polish Catholic domination. And well, across the centuries, as you can see, that Tsardom, which later became the Russian Tsardom and later became the Russian Empire in 1721, started to bring other lands into what would become Ukraine later on. As I said, the map is not exactly accurate. Yes, the Russian Tsars brought this part in yellow throughout the centuries, but they also brought whatever is in blue, whatever is in purple. But the map informs us that later on, after the Russian Revolution, after that Tsardom, that empire came down in 1917, well, the new Bolshevik leader, Lenin, after the Russian Civil War as well, he sort of joined all of this territory in blue, which was known as New Russia, Novorossiya, at some point. It joined it to what became the Ukrainian Republic. The fact that, you know, the current Russian government refers to this as Ukraine's construction well should not be a matter for us here. They can be right, they can be wrong, they can use it for propaganda purposes, but actually they have a point in which, in the fact that Lenin brought this under a sole Ukrainian republic inside the Soviet Union. As we know, since 1922, since December 1922, a new country, the Soviet Union, came into being. Later on, this part in green, as you know, after Stalin and Hitler basically divided Poland in 1939, invaded Poland from the west and from the east and divided it. Stalin thought it would be a good idea to join this part to Ukraine because there were huge Ukrainian minorities, but actually majorities in those provinces. And he joined this part to Ukraine. This had been Poland since the 14th century. I mean, this city, Lviv, the biggest city in Ukraine's west, was actually a Polish city until 1945. It was called Lvov, and there was a majority Polish population living there. The Ukrainians lived outside the cities; they lived in the rural areas. But it was a Polish city, and you, as political science students, will be very interested in knowing that today Lviv is, so to say, the heart of Ukrainian nationalism, for example, since 1991, since independence. But until 1945, it was a Polish city, which is very interesting. As you know, during World War II, of course, all of this, most of the territory was under Nazi rule, and then the Red Army once again brought it under control in 1945. Here, that's why I say that the map is not so very accurate, but here there's another part called Zakarpattia, province called Zakarpattia, which Stalin took from Czechoslovakia. Here there is a province called Chernivtsi that Stalin took from Romania. Here there is territory that was taken also from Romania with a lot of Bulgarian populations. So at the end of World War II, again, we still see Ukraine growing. All of this was attached to the Ukrainian Republic inside the Soviet Union in this very interesting Soviet federalism. You can take a look, for example, at Terry Martin's book, The Affirmative Action Empire from 2001, in which he talks about this very interesting Bolshevik policy of Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, and how Lenin back in 1922-23 tried to avoid nationalism by giving some of the nations of Soviet Russia, by giving them republics, by giving them institutions, by giving them culture, to let them speak their own language, to make it administrative languages, and so on, which is a very, very interesting book. I recommend it to you. And even as late as 1954, for example, we have Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, who brought yet more territory to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian Republic. This was Crimea, of course, the peninsula of Crimea, which, contrary to the rest of the Ukrainian territory, Crimea was the only region where Russians were in a majority. Actually, the 2001 census, all Ukrainian census, says that 58% of the population of Crimea were Russians. Unfortunately, that's the only census that we have in independent Ukraine, so we have to stick to that data. So again, this map is probably informal and inaccurate, but at least it helps you graphically see a bit how Ukraine came to be for different reasons, in many different political moments, in different contexts, throughout 2 world wars, after the fall of an empire, and so on. So moving on, well, we come to 1991. Ukraine becomes on August 24th the first Soviet republic to declare its independence on that date. In the end, they achieve independence, as all of the rest of Soviet republics, by December 1991. There's a big referendum in December 1991. 92% of the Ukrainian population vote for becoming independent. Interestingly enough, some months prior to that, in March 1991, if I'm not wrong, there was a first referendum, and that was a referendum made in the whole Soviet Union by the leader Gorbachev, as you know, and he wanted to ask in every Soviet republic whether they wanted to preserve the Union, to stay as one country. And in Ukraine, 71% of the population voted in favor of preserving the Soviet Union, but the Ukrainian Republic should be really autonomous. I mean, it was in theory autonomous since 1918, since the Bolsheviks took over, but they wanted real autonomy, which is very interesting that in March they voted to stay in the Soviet Union, but with autonomy. And next December, they voted for independence, even in greater numbers, which also, for you as political scientists, will tell you something about how empires fall, how the elites, the peripheral elites within empires try to seize opportunities when they see that the center is not very strong, and I'm referring, of course, to the August 1991 coup against Gorbachev, which in the end failed after a few days, and that's the moment when, on August 24th, the Ukrainian elite, led by President Leonid Kravchuk, decides to declare independence. And you can read about this as well in a magnificent book by Harvard historian Serhiy Blokhy, a Ukrainian himself. He wrote The Last Days of the Soviet Union, an amazing book in which he tells us this story, and with a particular weakness, of course, for Ukraine, and how President Kravchuk and the elite around him in those days of August 1991, they decided to go from autonomy to full independence after the failed coup on Gorbachev. So we arrive then to 1991, 92. Already we have an independent Ukraine, a new country that is born with two main, we can say, political and juridical decisions, which will have consequences later on for, until today, which are, first of all, that Ukraine is born as a unitary state. What does that mean? Contrary to the Soviet federalist tradition, which Russia inherited, for example, contrary to that, Ukraine becomes a unitary state where, people do not vote for their governors. If you are from the US or from Mexico, my country, that sounds weird. that you cannot vote for your governor. But in Ukraine, it's actually the normal thing since 1991. So it becomes a unitary state, which means that basically the president appoints the governors, and the center is the one that decides regional policy by decree, basically, which happens until today. That's the first moment of Ukrainian statehood. And the second one, with consequences until today, is that that the Ukrainian language becomes the only official language of the country, which means basically that, education is mostly provided in Ukrainian, which means that when you go to any government institution, all your papers should be basically in Ukrainian, although you may speak Russian, but they should be in Ukrainian. Or you can speak another language, like Hungarian right here in Zakarpattia, or Romanian in Chernivtsi, or Bulgarian down here, or Russian or Tatar in Crimea. But basically your documents should be in Ukrainian, and Ukrainian is the official language of the country, the only one. Even though, as the great late historian Orest Subtelny, Canadian of Ukrainian origin, by the way, said, not even 50% of the population dominated the Ukrainian language by 1991 still. Not even by half of the decade, when in 96 the constitution was finally accepted in parliament. So that was an interesting decision from the Ukrainian leadership. First of all, that we're going to be a unitary state, that the president is going to appoint the governors, and that Ukrainian is going to be the only official language of the country. Although, yes, we know that Russian is prominent in many provinces, but it will have, like a second-hand status. And yes, we will write in the constitution that, yes, we protect Russian and other minority languages, but Ukrainian is the official language. So those foundational moments at the beginning of the 90s were already hinting towards the kind of state that was going to be developing afterwards, right? So we can take a look at this map. Again, not an extremely formal map, but it helps us see, based on the census of 2001 and some other information, data, it helps us to understand how there is basically, a northwest Ukraine, where we have Ukrainian speakers mostly, and we have a southeast where we have Russian speakers mostly. This is the ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. Remember that the majority of the population in Crimea are Russians, and we will come to that later. But in these two provinces, Donetsk, Luhansk, very famous nowadays, the majority of the population is not Russian. They are Ukrainians, but there are strong Russian minorities, 38% in Donetsk, 39% in Lugansk, again, according to the 2001 census. Of course, after 20 years, 22 years, and after the huge war that has been developing there since 2014, we cannot know exactly what is the current demographic situation in the Donbas, or even in the rest of the country, for very obvious reasons. But again, this division is quite interesting, and it is the most interesting part is that you will see this is not only a linguistic division, but it will go beyond that. Of course, nowadays the majority of Ukrainians, especially those who are young or younger than, I mean, who started school in the 90s, of course, nowadays they are basically bilingual and they can communicate in both languages. And they don't have a problem speaking either one or the other, depending on where we're talking about. But it is a fact that, you know, Russian is the most spoken language here, Ukrainian is the most spoken language here, and actually the capital Kiev, which is here, at least in the 90s and at least in the early 2000s, the majority of the inhabitants spoke Russian. It seems that nowadays it's very, very, I mean, it's almost 50 and 50% of those who speak Russian and those who speak Ukrainian in Kiev, according to some polls. But anyway, what is interesting to see throughout the years is that this division, some provinces more, some provinces less, but this division is perpetuated in the political field, in the economic field, and in the, what I call the outer references field. But we will get to that. So first of all, in the political field, it's very interesting to see how in different moments, in different elections, both presidential and regional and parliamentary, we have seen this division somehow perpetuate itself. Sorry if this is in Spanish. It means the presidential election of 1994, the first presidential election in independent Ukraine. And you can see that in 12 provinces of the West or Northwest, people voted for Leonid Kravchuk, who was the incumbent and who was the president that was doing these new reforms and Ukrainization of the country. And he had a sort of course, he was not a big nationalist, but he was playing the nationalist card in order to, you know, build the new country, etc. And in 13 provinces in the south and the east, Leonid Kuchma was voted. He actually won the election, and Kuchma campaigned with a more relaxed approach towards Ukrainization, to focus more on economic reform, to focus more on technical stuff, and to bring into the decision-making process as well the people from the southeast, where, as I said, the Russian minorities here, or the Russian majority here, are very prominent. In the end, Kuchma won. He actually sort of failed to fulfill his promise, although he did try to focus on economic reforms. But it's interesting to see this very division later on. We have, for example, I mean, this doesn't happen in every election, but when it happens, it's something really, really interesting. It's basically the same provinces here and there. So this is the 2010 election, presidential election between a nationalist candidate, Yulia Tymoshenko, and in the southeast, a non-nationalist candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, who actually came from Donetsk, right here. You can see basically the same division, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And here you can see it even to the municipal level, to the rayon or municipal level, which is very interesting. So you can see that over the years, and we have more. This is the parliamentary election of 2012. 2 years after this, so you can compare, it's basically the same. In the Northwest, you have more nationalist parties, or at least with a more national rhetoric. Even far-right national parties like Svoboda here in Galicia. And you have in the Southeast some, I wouldn't say pro-Russian parties, I think that's kind of misleading. Yes, they are pro-Russian in their outer references, as I said, but they are actually regionalist. They support, regionalism, federalism, if it's possible, or to whatever extent it is possible, protectionism of the local industry, this sort of stuff. To just label them pro-Russian is kind of, not exact, not very accurate. Although they are pro-Russian in their outer references, which means culturally, the voters of this party, which was the Party of Regions, and then it was called Opposition Platform, Opposition Bloc, then Opposition Platform nowadays. Yes, they again, I'm talking before the 24th of February of 2022, before the invasion. I mean, this party and their voters sort of saw in Russia some sort of cultural reference, a shared history, also the fact that Russia is a federation and that they are not, but they might want to be because they're very regionalists, etc. And they sort of don't like whatever nationalistic rhetoric is coming from Kiev, etc., etc. I mean, these are the positions of the party, or of the different parties that have gathered the votes here. Actually, here the Communist Party even made a political comeback in 2012. The Communist Party, which actually was the most voted party in the country in the late 90s, by the way. But anyway, so you can see these divisions. These are the local Ukrainian elections of 2020. Again, you see more or less the same. These regionalist parties here, these more nationalist parties here. And now I turn, having explained this, let's turn to this map, which is, I think, the most interesting of all. So we have seen that in cultural and in political terms, we have that division, which is very clear, and it comes time and time again. Actually, in the latest two presidential elections, sorry that I come back, but in the latest two presidential elections, 2014, 2019, this division has actually been kind of erased. President Zelensky in 2019 won in basically almost every province in the country. But when you come back to the regional elections, like here in 2020, and to parliamentary elections, you can see that things are a bit different. You have this division once again, which is an interesting phenomenon, that this division does not go away definitely. Okay, so now we can talk about economic divisions. So basically, I mean, you can see here that the West, or again, the Northwest, part of the center, but mostly this same region, the Northwest of Ukraine, is agriculture oriented, as you can see here. I mean, its economy is overwhelmingly rural. And it has one of the most, I mean, historically, it has had one of the most fertile soils in the planet. like, for example, as you can see here, Ukraine and the production in this region is a main provider to the European Union of colza oil, for example, which is used as a biofuel and which amounts to 80% of the biodiesel used in the European Union. It is the first world producer of sunflower oil, which can also be, in one of its variants, used as a biofuel. So, I mean, there's a big potential, a big agricultural potential in all these regions, in all the Northwest. And again, I don't know about your different formations and interests, but we know that usually the more agrarian regions, the more agricultural regions tend to be the most nationalist. In history, in political science, we used to learn that, which is a very interesting fact, which coincides again with the political and with the political and electoral maps that we have seen here. So, for example, in 2013, a fourth of 25%, I mean, of Ukraine's exports were basically food and agricultural products. In 2021, last year, it amounted to a third of its exports. So it is a big part of the economy. It is a big part of exports. And it's one of the main national prides. And actually, Article 14 of the Constitution protects the soil. There's an article in the Constitution made specifically to protect the Ukrainian soil and to subsidize it 100%. At least that was the situation until the reforms of 2014, 15, 16. But before that, it was 100%, almost 100% funded by the state. So, I mean, funded by the state through something called the Agrarian Fund, Agrofond or Agrofond. But of course, as you know, in the budget, depending on who's on power, depending on the economic financial situation, that subsidy becomes politicized. And sometimes the subsidy is not enough, especially to boost the huge agricultural potential that these regions have. So already in the last 2 decades, even more, there has been a sort of lobby, an agricultural lobby in Ukraine, of course, made of politicians and big farmers and landowners from these regions, pushing Ukraine towards the European Union, because, as you know, the European Union subsidizes agriculture through the common agricultural policy in huge amounts, just huge amounts. And this lobby, of course, wants to get that money to boost the huge agricultural potential, because the subsidy of the Ukrainian government is not enough. So the European Union is a huge alternative to these regions in the West, Northwest, that live from agriculture. On the contrary, the regions that live from industry, mostly here in the East, they do not want to enter the European Union. Why? Because they know that their old Soviet-style industry, it's not up to date. It will not survive much competition. It doesn't even have the ecological standards that the European Union demands. So again, in this protectionism, this regionalism is also explained by those local values of that old industrial, old Soviet industrial economy. Although actually it may be old and it may be Soviet still in some of its values and ways, but actually the Donbass right here is, or at least used to be before the 2014 war, the richest part of the country. And if you have a rural Ukraine, if you move here, you have a more urban Ukraine when you move to the right, when you move to the east. The Donbass used to be the most populated part of the country, the most densely populated part of the country, and also regions like Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, Odessa, of course. Although here in the south, of course, thanks to tourism, these ones are more services oriented and live from tourism. But again, you can see sort of a division as well in the economical part of the equation. And I mean, doing a bit of history, it's interesting to note how actually things unfolded until the Maidan protests of late 2013. So why do I link this agricultural potential to the Maidan? Because there is very interesting data which shows that, for example, between 2005 and 2010, meaning in the Yushchenko presidency, Yushchenko was a nationalist president, he gave the biggest support to this region, the biggest support to rural Ukraine through the Agrarian Fund. Although there was a bit of a setback after 2008 because of the world financial crisis and the financial instability in Ukraine and a lot of corruption. But Yushchenko became sort of a champion of this region. And it's not actually a coincidence. This is the region that brought Yushchenko to power, the more nationalistic part of the country that brought President Yushchenko to power, and he had to deliver, and he helped a lot, and he raised the subsidies to this region through the Agrarian Fund. In 2010, after, again, we come back here, after this happened, after Viktor Yanukovych, who came from Donetsk, became president, things started to change in that region. And although there was an economic recovery by 2011, 2012, and even though in 2013, the region saw a huge record harvest and a record of exports to Europe as well, the budget in late 2012 already did not give money to many of these regions. Especially, it did not subsidize grain. It stopped subsidizing grain. It just subsidized cereals and some other fertilizers, etc. But it did not subsidize grain. And actually, Yanukovych and the parliament, the Rada, in late 2012, when devising the 2013 budget, they cut in less than half the money for these subsidies, which of course amounted to a big dissolution in Western Ukraine. But that was not everything. Actually, a year later, in November 2013, Yanukovych said, well, this association agreement that the Yushchenko government signed with the European Union in order to become part of the European Union, we're going to cancel it because, I mean, he gave a lot of excuses, but again, look at this map, look at the part where Yanukovych comes from, look at this map as well. I mean, he was basically just as Yushchenko did before him. Now Yanukovych was answering to his own electorate, to his voters. There was a big election coming on. He wanted re-election, and he basically said no to the European Union in November 2013, so that he could be loyal to his own regions, to his own voters. Again, you're political science students. I'm trying to from that point of view to make you understand actors and decisions and regional logics. So I hope you're following me on this. You may like the characters, you may not like the characters, but I'm just trying to help you understand the logics here. And what happened after November 2013? Well, as you know, the Maidan or Euromaidan revolution came in Kiev. And I mean, we already have a lot of literature on that revolution. It lasted 3 months until late February 2014. In the end, Yanukovych had to resign and he left the country. But we already know that the majority of protesters in the Euromaidan came, of course, from these regions. I mean, it's not a mystery why. I mean, they depended on a promise of Europe, on a promise of funds, on a promise of subsidies that suddenly everything came down. And they were deceived, and they felt deceived by the government, and they went to Kiev to protest. And of course, outside of Kiev, the majority of protests were registered right here in Galicia, especially in Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Lviv oblasts. Few people came from the southeast, of course, because I mean the protests were against their guy, right, against Yanukovych. So very few people came from the south and the east of the country. The Euromaidan was basically that. It was. I mean, the media sold it as, you know, this huge national movement against corruption. But actually, we already know that it had much more regionalistic overtones, as usually happens in Ukrainian politics. So actually, during the Maidan, while the cabinet was in session in Kiev, and while outside in the street there was a huge revolution going on from all these protesters, some of them occupied the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. Of course, you didn't hear much of this in the news, but the protesters occupied the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. And actually, while the building was being occupied, the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, answering to Yanukovych, still, this was in late January 2014, decided to create a new subsidiary company of the agrarian fund called Agrofond Zerno. Zerno means grain, because remember that grain wasn't funded by then by the Yanukovych government. Well, suddenly, while the Ministry of Food and Agriculture is being held by protesters outside, the Cabinet of Ministers decides to implement this subsidiary company, especially for grain. And later on in February 18th, it was already late, but they decided also to create another fund of a subsidiary fund of the agrarian fund to give credits to farmers. So that gives you a hint of what, I mean, it's not normal that protesters just go and get inside the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, right? It's not the first thing you think about when making a revolution, unless you have a direct stake in it. So that's a very interesting fact that actually escaped, the traditional narratives. Of course, after February 2014, when Yanukovych resigned and a new government, interim government, took over, things changed completely. And the new government, of course, re-established the association agreement with the European Union for obvious reasons. And here's the obvious reasons. I mean, the new interim government was made up of three parties, of the one in pink, which is Batkivshina, Fatherland, the Yulia Tymoshenko party, the biggest party back then in northwest Ukraine, Udar, the party of current Kiev mayor Vitaly Klitschko, and Svoboda, the main party in Galicia, which is a far-right nationalist party. And they made a coalition government. And again, given that the Ukrainian president appoints governors, the interim president, who was Alexander Turchinov from the Batkivshina party, the Fatherland party in pink here, he appointed governors from these three parties, right? Everywhere, even in these regions where, those governors were not seen with very good eyes, especially those coming from the Svoboda party. And they also shared ministries, and the three parties decided to accommodate different ministries among themselves, which, I mean, the law allows for, because of what I told you, Ukraine is a unitary state. So what happened in the end? This new coalition brought very radical changes, and I'm just going to talk about two of them. Well, the first is, of course, the political change, and the next day, Parliament basically changed allegiances, and new parties were made all of a sudden, and they pleaded allegiance to the new interim government. But the next thing that the Parliament did the same day, I mean, the second day after Yanukovych resigned, was to repeal a language law. A language law that Yanukovych had, I mean, his government, his administration, his party, actually with the vote of some other parties, which cannot be labeled pro-Russian, back in 2012, had passed. And this law, called language law or law on languages, made any language different from Ukrainian official in any given province at the provincial level if more than 10% of the population spoke it. So all of a sudden, and I'm coming back to, well, let's go here. Yeah. So all of a sudden, Russian was official in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Kharkiv, in Crimea, of course. In these regions, Russian all of a sudden became a local official language. And Bulgarian down here, and Romanian in Chernivtsi, and Hungarian in Zakarpattia, and the like. So that was in 2012. But the first thing after Yanukovych's resignation that the new coalition and the new parliamentary factions, the new improvised parliamentary factions did in February 2014, after Yanukovych fled, was to repeal the language law. Of course, that was pressure from the Svoboda party and its nationalist far-right views, which basically say that here we are Ukrainian and we speak Ukrainian and we're all Ukrainians and that's it. And, you know, basically don't ask questions. So after that, what happened? Well, of course, there was a lot of anger now in the other part of Ukraine, now in the southeast of the country, because suddenly your language was official and then now it's not official, which is weird. And the guy who was in power, who represented your interest, now doesn't. I mean, he fled the country, and now some people from you know, from the other part of the country who are nationalists, they took over, and I mean, that's not nice for us. I mean, I'm trying to make it sort of down to earth for you to understand the local logics. So of course there was a lot of bad reception of this repeal and of other laws that came with it in the southeast. And Crimea, the peninsula right here, with a majority of Russian population, was the most dissatisfied in that sense. Crimea is a peculiar story because since 1995, it had the status of autonomous republic within the unitary Ukrainian state. And this was made by Kuchma in order to hold Crimea in the country. The thing with Crimea was that since 1991 and until 1997, the status of the Russian Black Fleet, of the Black Sea Fleet, sorry, was at stake, because the Black Sea Fleet, which was stationed here in Sevastopol, in the famous port of Sevastopol, it was controlled by Russia. It was controlled from Moscow. But until 1997, it was inside the Ukrainian state. So there was a bit of tensions between Russia and Ukraine because of that. In the end, Kuchma, as the great negotiator that he was, decided that he would make a bilateral treaty with Russia in 1997. And both signed a treaty saying that basically Russia can have 81% of the Black Sea Fleet in exchange for, you know, for gas subsidies, or for lowering the price of gas that comes from Russia into Ukraine. But that was not everything. The treaty also allowed Russia to have 25,000 troops in Crimea legally. This is 1997 still. And Kuchma accepted. And again, this is another decision that has consequences today, or that had consequences at that moment in March 2014, after the new interim government, nationalistic, not exactly nationalist, but nationalistic government comes into view. And suddenly, well, what happened? As you know, those troops, those Russian troops in Crimea, in March 2014 helped the local Crimean government to make a referendum, basically asking people whether they wanted to stay in Ukraine or to secede and to join Russia eventually. And we know what happened. allegedly, the majority of the population voted to leave and to join Russia, and it joined Russia in March 2014 as actually two different federal entities. One is the Republic of Crimea, and the other is Sevastopol, which has actually a separate federal entity. Those of you who study federalism, if any, might find that interesting. Basically because the whole fleet, the whole Black Sea Fleet is stationed there. The Ukrainian army actually left the peninsula in March 2014. They just left it de facto in Russian hands. They couldn't do much, and they just left it. So, as you know, Crimea became Russian. And in the next weeks after that, in April 2014, some protests began in several cities of southeast Ukraine, again, against these new laws and against this coalition. And what happened in Donetsk, which is right here. Oh, sorry, I put this map because you can see in red the Russian speakers, or those who say that Russian is their mother tongue. This is from the 2001 census. In blue, those who say that Ukrainian is their mother tongue. In red, those who say Russian is their mother tongue. And actually, many analysts say that this question was framed precisely to show that Ukrainian is wider. Because if you ask, instead of what is your mother tongue, if you ask what is the language you speak every day at home or in the street, well, the map would look a bit much more like the one I showed you earlier. But at least this map is helpful because it shows us those who acknowledge themselves as Russians, not only as Russian speakers, but as ethnic Russians. And it is actually very, I mean, it really shows those who are the Russian minorities. Again, 38% here, 39% here, basically all of Crimea, etc. So I put this map here because when we talk about April 2014, we can see the populations that did not like that new government, the populations that started to protest against it. And what happened was that at some point in April 2014, around 100 people took the building of the Donetsk administration, of the regional administration right here. I mean, probably they probably I don't know, ordered pizza or whatever to just do something. They must have been really bored. And instead of negotiating, you know, the liberation of the building or calling in the police, because the police started to go on the side of the protesters, the Ukrainian government, because again, the Ukrainian government decides the regional policies, just decided simply to send the army to get them out. This is April 2014, and the Ukrainian government, President Alexander Turchinov and Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who were actually not nationalists at all, but had to give in because they had Svoboda and other groups, other radical right-wing nationalist groups in other centers of power and in the coalition. Well, they had to let them do basically whatever they wanted, and the Ukrainian government called it the anti-terrorist operation. They sent from Kiev and from other parts, they sent the army to get those people out. It's very interesting that still before this operation started, the separatism in the region, in Donbass, was about 30%, even less. And in May, the Institute of Sociology of Kiev, registered that when the anti-terrorist operation started, already almost 50% of the population in Donbass wanted to leave the country and to separate from the Ukraine. So, of course, this operation, so-called anti-terrorist operation, helped to create more separatism. But also, if you put yourselves on the feet of the Ukrainian officials in Kiev, they thought, well, this is the richest part of the country. We cannot let it go. We can let go Crimea. There's a majority of Russians there. It lives from tourism. It was never really happy inside independent Ukraine. Okay, and it's not really a big thing for Ukrainian nationalism or whatever, but this part is the richest part of the country. We just cannot let it go. So that also helps you to understand from both sides the decision. That is how the Donbas War started in April 2014, when the army was sent in and the locals resorted to outright rebellion. Russia's role, specifically in those months, April, May, June, is not that traceable, but Russia did already in summer help the rebels, especially help them not to get wiped out by the Ukrainian army, because the Ukrainian army made very big offenses in summer, and then Russia helped the rebels, the locals, with a lot of weapons and several, between volunteers and people from the Russian military staff that went there and helped them with military tactics to help them in any way. And in the end, as you know, that was basically the situation until 2016, when the ceasefires basically began. On the Donbas, it should be noted that there has been, of course, an ongoing conflict since 2014, since this moment until today. But it has its own local logics. It has its own local explanations. There's a lot of people who legitimately want to join Russia. There's a lot of people who don't. It's very difficult to tell who does, who doesn't. What we know is that today, well, not today, since 2016, in those years, those 2 years between 2014 and 2016, over 2.5 million refugees left the Donbass because of the conflict. 1 million left to Russia, and the other 1.5 million left towards other parts of Ukraine, and a very tiny minority to Poland and Belarus. This is 2014, 15, 16 we're talking about, some years ago. We're talking about the Donbas War. And since 2016, there were basically ceasefires, and the borders of the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics didn't move much until 2 months ago, which is another story, which of course originated here, and it has everything to do. But after February 2002, we have a completely different story right here. So, well, as you know, all of this inside Ukraine has this background, the background of the geopolitical reaccommodation in Europe. And well, here you can see, actually there's a mistake here. It should say 1989. I didn't do the map. It should say 1989 because in 1990 these countries already were not socialist. But in 1989 we have NATO since 1949, which, as you know, is a military alliance built by the United States in Europe to support European security and to contain the Soviet Union back then, which grew in size as time passed. And you had the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet response to NATO since 1949, and it, of course, had all the Soviet satellites in Eastern Europe. But in 1990, as we know, well, socialism had fallen, sorry, and especially Germany had reunified. So there's a big it's kind of a myth, but it holds some truth to it that you know, President Bush father told Gorbachev that, you know, if you accept German reunification and a reunified Germany in NATO, then we are not going to make NATO bigger. We're not going to amplify, we're not going to extend NATO whatsoever. And the myth goes that Gorbachev said, okay. I mean, of course, it was a completely different context. And after 1991, there was already no Soviet Union. So there was a new configuration even within this within these years. So in the end, if you look at the map below, well, you have NATO extended to basically almost all of Eastern Europe. That map is from 2015. We should add North Macedonia right here. In 2020, we have Montenegro, 2019. And I mean, this is the background, of course, in geopolitical military terms of what is going on today. You know, the realist school of international relations, I also studied IR, you know, the realist school would tell you this is completely wrong because, you know, there's an imbalance of power. Here we had a balance of power, and here we don't have a balance of power anymore. And one of the actors has gained a lot of power and actually wants more power. And of course, the other actor tries to retaliate in every means possible. That's what the realist school of international relations would say. The idealist or liberal school would tell you, well, this is good because we're bringing peace, and because the further NATO expands, and the further peace and Western values and whatever are brought to different peoples who should be able to decide by themselves on which side they want to be and which alliances they want to join. And they should not be left alone in the fight against the aggressor. So you have these two different visions. I am more for a constructivist approach to international relations, so I'm not much of a realist, less of an idealist. I try to understand why these things happen, how do they unfold, and well, I mean, now we even have, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we now have even Sweden and Finland very seriously trying to get into NATO, or at least considering it. Although there are some reservations. The Finnish president Sauli Niinistö is kind of hesitant, although he actually met today with Jens Stoltenberg, who is NATO's Secretary General. But the Finnish president might be kind of hesitant towards this. And of course, the last decision will have to be taken by him. Yesterday, we listened to the president of Croatia, Zoran Milanovic, who said, don't count with us. Don't count with Croatia. As you know, every NATO member has to ratify the inclusion of a new member. That's why Macedonia actually changed its name from Republic of Macedonia, Republic of Macedonia to North Macedonia, because Greece was vetoing Macedonia. Greece said, we don't like that you use the name Macedonia because only we can claim Macedonia. So for some reason that was not a scandal, but anyway. So this is the background, and I don't have to go further, I believe. So I finish with this last slide. Here you have the current maps of the conflict in Ukraine, taken from Al Jazeera, which has this live track updated every day, which I find very useful. So this is March 28th, a month ago, and this is today, actually, April 28th, 9:30 GMT. So, I mean, as a constructivist, I am completely against these big narratives and rhetorics of, you know, one day Putin decided to invade and he is the most evil person in the world and we should get rid of him, and he hates the Ukrainian people. And I mean, these kind of narratives, I don't buy them. Like the CNN sort of narratives, I don't buy them. That doesn't mean I like Putin or that I hate Putin or whatever. I just don't buy those narratives. I like to question things, and I see the world as being much more complicated than that. And living in Russia and working in Russia and studying Russia, I have come to understand many things from this side of the equation, which doesn't mean that I justify or whatever. I'm completely against what is going on since February 24th. But you know, I try to understand the whys, and I give you right here some answers. I do not have complete answers. As a good constructivist, I also am in the minority of social scientists who say, I don't know, or we cannot know completely. And I think that's a very healthy thing to do, unless all the experts that say they know everything and they actually do not know anything. So there are things that we cannot know, and there are things that we can know. We cannot know what Putin and the Minister of Defense Shoigu and, you know, the military cliques and political cliques in Russia decided. We won't know maybe for for a while. For a while, I mean many years, until someone goes into the archives whenever they are declassified, and we can see what was the intention, and we can see what they had in mind. But we can know some things, and we saw it in the negotiations table, which I don't think it was a coincidence that the negotiations table was set already on the 29th of sorry, on the 1st of March. That is 5 days after the invasion started. Whether because it was planned like that, or because there were setbacks for the Russian army, I don't think we can know that. But I don't think that it's a coincidence that 5 days after the intervention started, Russia sat down at the negotiation table, and it basically, Russia basically asked, for example, that Ukraine guarantee its neutrality, that it won't get into NATO. I mean, that that actually that was the only point probably in which the Ukrainian government said, okay, that we can do. Okay. A second point, which was also very talked about, but it was not, of course, completely reflected at the negotiations table, was to stop Zelensky from what not only Russian but also Western figures and analysts and politicians called witch hunt. Zelensky actually, since March 2021, started to, I mean, his numbers started to go down in the polls, and he started to resort to a more nationalistic rhetoric, when he had actually a much more regionalistic and more amplified rhetoric. Actually, he when his numbers went down in the polls, he started, to use the nationalist trope, which worked for every Ukrainian president in the past, except Poroshenko, probably. But Zelensky started to go after some political figures. For example, Viktor Medvedchuk, whom you may have heard of. He is sometimes called one of many of Russia's men in Ukraine. He's one of the parliamentary leaders of the opposition platform, the party which is, as you know, stronger, as I already told you, in Southeast Ukraine, which is actually the second biggest party in parliament, and which nowadays has been outlawed by Zelensky during martial law. Maybe it will be re-legalized later on, maybe not. But since March 2021, Zelensky had him basically arrested at home. And he didn't only go after him, he also tried to go against former President Poroshenko. Poroshenko even came back to the country in a defiant mood, and in the end, he couldn't be arrested. But there was what some analysts call a small witch hunt by Zelensky, which was already taking down Russia's allies inside of Ukraine. So another possible motive was, to guarantee that Medvedchuk and other Russian allies inside Ukraine didn't become political prisoners, and that Zelensky didn't use them to get more power. And so there's also this attempt to make Zelensky weaker. Although, as we know, Zelensky has just become stronger after all of this, and now he's a Western hero. And now every politician in Europe has to go to Kiev to, take photos with him. So that's an interesting phenomenon. Another very clear, this one is very clear in the way the intervention or invasion started, was to demilitarize Ukraine. Basically, all the military infrastructure that Ukraine built since 2014 with the help of the West and of NATO and of the United States, especially, all the armaments, all the weaponry, all the drones from Turkey, all the weapons, all the equipment that Ukraine got from since 2014 to make the war in Donbass. It was very clear that Russia, at least beginning, wanted to demilitarize and to render this infrastructure useless. Yes, sorry.
I'm so sorry. We only have a couple of minutes left. I don't know if you can summarize quickly and maybe
I'm
give
finishing. Yeah, I'm finishing with this. So I mean, this is one of the points that we can know about. Russia did want to demilitarize, to render some infrastructure useless, to recover whatever infrastructure, whatever equipment it could as well, to take over it, etc. A fourth point is this this thing called denazification by Russia, of course, with a lot of drama, with a lot of dramatism, which basically means, you know, outlawing these parties and these associations, these far-right parties in Ukraine, and this rhetoric, very strong rhetoric that interestingly has come from the Galician regional yet nationalist parties to the national level. And actually those parties, the most interesting thing here is that the ultra-right and the far-right in Ukraine are not strong. They're not strong in political and electoral terms. They're marginal in every election, but they have managed since 2014 to get hold of I mean, to expand their interests, part of their program and part of their rhetoric, especially to several institutions of Ukraine, the National Security Council, the army, you know, the famous Azov battalion. I mean, it's real. I'm not saying anything that you don't know. So this is what Russia also calls the denazification. And finally, as we have seen in the last month, it is clear that Russia has already given up the hopes of doing whatever they wanted to do by putting pressure on Kiev physically. And they have resorted to helping the so-called republics to take all the territory that they claim to possess in their independentist dreams. So it still remains to be seen whether Russia will try to take Ukrainian territory, to annex, or what is going to happen. I think it's very difficult to know exactly at the moment what is going to happen, but what is clear in that sense is that Lugansk and Donetsk are probably going to become independent also de facto, and they might join Russia later on, who knows. But I mean, that's the situation right now. And again, these are the things that we can actually know. So I mean, that's basically it. That's the picture, the big picture that I wanted to give you, with some recent historical events, facts, figures, so that you don't stay with this big narratives of, you know, the Ukrainian people and Putin, and I mean, it's much more complicated than that. we don't have to like or dislike any of the sides to try to understand what is going on. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rainer, for taking the time to speak with us about that. We're just about out of time, but there was one question from the audience I wanted to throw out. He put it in the chat. And what Axel told us is, when I traveled to the Baltic Seas, I could witness an immense societal division between ethnic Russians and ethnic Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. Would you say that there was a similar division in Ukraine before the current war or pre-2014?
Okay, thank you, Axel. Yeah, for example, in Latvia, it's very interesting. In Riga, you know, in the center of the city, you find the Latvians, and in the periphery, you find the Russians in the old Soviet buildings, which is a very interesting phenomenon. In Ukraine, it's interesting as well, because in the map where you saw the Russian speakers in red, you saw that they live in the cities. I mean, outside of Crimea, they basically live in the cities, in Donetsk, in Lugansk, in Kharkiv or Kharkov, and in other cities. So there is a division, yes, because those Russian settlers that came in Soviet times settled basically in the cities. But I have actually never been to Ukraine, and I don't know, when you're already physically there, if you can see that the Russians live here or there. But what I know is that, I mean, as everyone is a Russian speaker, or almost everyone is a Russian speaker in Southeast Ukraine, it's very difficult to know exactly, you know, who's Russian, who's not. And in this, I mean, this is a census. I mean, people answer to sociologists just, you know, they can be actually Russians, but they say my mother tongue is Ukrainian because my mother is Ukrainian or whatever. So I think I think, and I know it's harder to tell the difference there, for sure.
All right then. Well, unfortunately, we're about out of time, but thank you so much for coming over. It was a very insightful lecture you gave, and it will be available on YouTube in the coming days for anyone who's just coming in. And yes, we'll be preparing for our next panels. So thank you very much again, Rainer.
Thank you. Sorry for taking so much time.
It was lovely to hear.
Thank you
Oh,
for.
Carlos,
Thank you so much.
I hope I clarified something for you.
thank you. Well, all right then. You take care and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
All right.